28 below zero in the Ardennes forest. The German commander's breath turned to frost as he signed the surrender demand, smiling. 7 miles of perfect encirclement. 18,000 Americans trapped inside Bastogne, with no supplies, no reinforcements, no way out. In 48 hours, maybe less, they'd freeze to death or wave the white flag. Every road cut, every approach covered by panzer divisions. This was checkmate. The commander warmed his hands over a kerosene heater in his command post, 3 miles outside the town. He'd already drafted the victory telegram to Berlin. Just needed the Americans to accept reality. "Tell them it's Christmas mercy," he said to his translator. After December 25th, we show none. His officers were laughing. Actual laughter. They'd been passing around intercepted American radio transmissions all morning. Desperate calls for supplies. Requests for airdrops that couldn't happen because fog had grounded every plane in Europe for 6 straight days. The weather was working for Germany. Cold, dark, perfect killing conditions. One panzer commander was taking bets on whether the surrender would come before or after Christmas dinner. "Americans don't know winter warfare," another said. "They think war is supposed to be comfortable." Intelligence reports covered the table. Every single road into Bastogne. Blocked. Northern approach. 2 panzer divisions. Eastern approach. Artillery batteries. Western approach. Dug-in infantry with machine guns. Southern approach. Armored units positioned in defensive depth. The mathematics were simple. 18,000 men surrounded. Ammunition running low. Medical supplies almost gone. Temperature dropping every night. The 101st Airborne and scattered tank units inside had fought well for 6 days, but physics don't care about courage. You can't shoot what you don't have. You can't eat ammunition. Inside Bastogne, men were wrapping their feet in paper and rags to prevent frostbite. Medics were running out of morphine. Wounded soldiers lay in freezing cellars because there was nowhere else to put them. The Germans knew all of this. Their spotters watched everything. When the American general inside Bastogne, a man named McAuliffe, received the surrender demand, he'd sent back a one-word reply: nuts. The German officers thought this was American slang they didn't understand. Their translator explained it meant, "go to hell." This made them laugh harder. Brave words from men about to freeze. The commander looked at his maps one more time. 7 miles of encirclement, perfect positions, perfect weather, perfect trap. He'd studied at military academies. He understood logistics, supply lines, weather conditions. The Americans inside Bastogne were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. What he didn't know, what no German intelligence officer had figured out, was that 90 miles south, George Patton was staring at a map with grease pencil marks, showing something impossible. He'd already been moving for 48 hours, and German intelligence had missed it completely. End of chapter. 1 to 450 words. December 19th, 1944. Verdun, France. Emergency meeting at Supreme Allied Headquarters. Eisenhower looked around the table at his commanders. The German offensive through the Ardennes had punched a 50-mile bulge in Allied lines. Bastogne was surrounded. The situation was, in military terms, a disaster. "How fast can someone relieve Bastogne?" Eisenhower asked. The room went quiet. Commanders looked at maps, division positions, supply lines, weather forecasts, showing more fog, more cold, more impossible conditions. 5 days, one general said. Maybe a week. We'd need to reorganize. 48 hours. George Patton's voice cut through the room. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Every head turned. Someone actually laughed. Not mockery, disbelief. You don't move an army in 48 hours. You especially don't move an army in winter through fog, on ice-covered roads, while reorganizing the entire direction of your attack. George," Eisenhower said carefully, "the Third Army is 90 miles south, facing east. You're talking about turning 90 degrees to face north. That's 250,000 men, 6 divisions, complete pivot." Patton smiled. 48 hours. Here's what made it impossible. What every officer in that room understood. Armies don't turn on a dime. You're coordinating hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, complex supply chains, artillery batteries, tank battalions, infantry units, all of which need to know where they're going, what they're doing, who's on their flanks, where supplies will meet them. Normal military doctrine said this maneuver would take 10 to 14 days, minimum. Patton said 48 hours. What nobody in that room knew, what Patton didn't bother explaining, was that he'd already done the impossible part. 3 weeks earlier, he'd wargamed 6 different contingency attacks. 6 different scenarios for where the Germans might break through. He'd drafted complete operational orders for each one, put them in sealed envelopes, given them to his division commanders with code names: nickel, dime, quarter. His staff had rehearsed coordinating these phantom operations without knowing why. Radio procedures, movement schedules, supply point locations. All of it planned for battles that didn't exist yet. Until now, when Eisenhower asked how fast Patton could move, Patton wasn't planning. He was executing plans he'd made in November. December 20th, 3 in the morning. Division commanders across 3rd Army opened sealed envelopes. Inside, complete orders for a 90-degree pivot north. Attack routes, objectives, timing, coordination procedures, everything. Captain Jim Dwyer, 4th Armored Division, former schoolteacher from Akron, Ohio, read his orders twice. He was supposed to lead a column of 300 vehicles through darkness, through fog, using compass bearings, in radio silence, and arrive at a specific location 70 miles north in 36 hours. In Ohio, he'd taught algebra. Now he was calculating fuel consumption, vehicle spacing, and march speed to figure out if this was mathematically possible. Lieutenant Bob Knowles, insurance salesman from Philadelphia, read his orders and did what he'd done his whole career: assessed risk. Every variable said this shouldn't work. Ice, fog, darkness, no radio. Compressed timeline. Sergeant Mike Foster, mechanic from Detroit, read his orders and started calculating something else. How many vehicles would break down in this cold, and how fast he could fix them. By dawn, 3rd Army was moving. German reconnaissance spotted convoys heading north. They filed reports. Minor repositioning. Defensive adjustments. Their intelligence officers noted it and moved on. Americans don't move armies in winter. 72 hours later, that assumption would cost them everything. December 20th. The convoys started rolling at dawn. Ice everywhere. Roads that had been muddy in November were now frozen sheets of black ice hiding under snow. Fog so thick you couldn't see the vehicle 10 feet ahead of you. And 250,000 men trying to move north in complete radio silence. Captain Jim Dwyer sat in the lead jeep of his column. 300 vehicles stretched behind him in the darkness. He had a compass, a map, and orders that said he needed to be 70 miles north by December 22nd. No headlights allowed. Germans were watching. His drivers were following white tape he'd ordered stuck on every rear bumper. That's it. White tape in the fog. In Akron, he'd taught high school algebra, explained quadratic equations to teenagers who didn't care. Now he was doing math that actually mattered. 300 vehicles. Average speed 12 miles per hour on ice. Fuel consumption rates. Rest stops he couldn't afford to take. 4 tanks slid off the road in the first 6 hours. Went over an embankment in the fog. Dwyer heard the crashes behind him, kept moving. Patton's orders were clear. Speed matters more than perfection. Arrive incomplete, but arrive fast. His hands shook, holding the compass. Not from fear, from cold. 28 below zero feels different when you're in it for 20 hours straight. 90 miles south, Lieutenant Bob Knowles had a different problem. Half his tanks wouldn't start. The cold had frozen everything. Oil, fuel lines, hydraulics. Insurance salesman brain kicked in. Risk assessment. Wait for them to thaw naturally. 6 hours, maybe 8. They'd miss the timeline. Try to heat them. Risk of fire. Risk of German spotters seeing the flames. He chose risk. Light fires under the engine blocks, he ordered. Small fires. Controlled. His sergeants thought he was insane. You don't light fires in combat zones. But Knowles had spent 10 years calculating life insurance premiums. He knew how to measure acceptable risk versus catastrophic failure. Missing Patton's timeline was catastrophic. German spotters seeing small fires at dawn was acceptable. 80% of his tanks were running in 3 hours. He'd calculated correctly. Sergeant Mike Foster hadn't slept more than 90 minutes at a time in 3 days. The Detroit mechanic was moving up and down the column, fixing everything that broke. And everything was breaking. Transmissions seizing in the cold, tracks throwing in the ice, fuel pumps failing. When a supply truck threw a rod and died in the middle of the road, Foster didn't even try to fix it. 5 men pushed it off into a ditch. Keep moving. Speed over perfection. His hands were black with grease and oil. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. Muscle memory from Detroit assembly lines was the only thing keeping him working. He'd rebuilt transmissions blind and drunk at 3 a.m. back home. Now he was doing it frozen and exhausted in Belgium. "How long you been awake, Sarge?" a private asked. Foster couldn't remember. 70 hours? 80? German intelligence was filing reports. Increased activity in 3rd Army Sector. Possible spoiling attack. Regiment-sized movement. Probably defensive repositioning. They were watching an entire army pivot 90 degrees and seeing what they expected to see. Minor adjustments. Their bias was killing them. Americans don't move armies in winter. Everyone knows that. By December 23rd, 3rd Army had moved 100 miles north in 72 hours, still in fog, still in radio silence, still invisible to German strategic intelligence. Inside Bastogne, men were making jokes about Christmas, gallows humor, anyone coming to dinner, or are we eating alone? They didn't know Patton's pivot was 20 miles away. The German commander was drafting his victory telegram. He'd give the Americans until December 26th. After that, final assault. The ring was perfect. Nothing was coming to save them. On Christmas morning, the fog lifted. For the first time in a week, the sun broke through. German spotters on the southern perimeter scanned north out of habit, watching for breakout attempts from inside Bastogne. Then one of them glanced south. The horizon was dark with vehicles, hundreds of them, thousands, an entire army that their intelligence said was 100 miles away 3 days ago. They had 12 hours before Patton's pivot struck. End of chapter 3 to 550 words. December 26th, 1944. 6 in the morning. 15 degrees. Clear skies for the first time in a week. Captain Jim Dwyer sat in his command tank 3 miles from the German southern perimeter. Forward observers had been watching German positions since dawn. The panzers were dug in facing north, every single one of them. They were ready for Americans trying to break out of Bastogne. Nobody was watching south. "They don't know we're here," Dwyer said into the radio. At exactly 6:15, 18 artillery batteries opened fire. 3 minutes of sustained barrage. The sound was continuous thunder. Shells screaming over Dwyer's position and landing on German defensive lines that weren't defensive at all. They were offensive positions facing the wrong direction. German radio traffic went insane. "Where is this coming from? We have armor from the south, multiple battalions." Their panzer commanders were trying to redirect units, trying to turn guns around. But you don't pivot armor quickly in frozen ground while under artillery fire. The math doesn't work. At 6:20, the barrage stopped. Dwyer's column started moving. 40 Sherman tanks. Supporting infantry. Direct assault on the village of Assenois, the weakest point in the 7-mile ring. Weakest, because Germans never thought they'd need strength there. Who attacks from the south? There's no American army within 100 miles. Except there was. Lieutenant Bob Knowles was in the lead tank. The insurance salesman who'd calculated acceptable risk for 10 years was now betting his life on speed and surprise. His tank was 4th in column. 3rd tank hit a mine. Exploded. Knowles's tank went around it without slowing down. German machine gun fire started. Tracer rounds arcing through morning light. Knowles's tank took 3 hits to the front armor. Kept moving. In Philadelphia, he'd sold life insurance policies. Here, he was gambling that German anti-tank guns couldn't reload fast enough. He won that bet. The Sherman column hit Assenois at 6:40. 2 companies of German infantry, 4 panzers, against 40 American tanks and 500 infantry. The math was brutal. House-to-house fighting in village streets. German soldiers firing from windows. American tanks putting high explosive rounds through walls. The cold made everything sharper sounds, impacts, the crack of rifles in frozen air. Sergeant Foster's tank through a track in the middle of the main street. Germans 50 yards away firing at anything that moved. Foster jumped out with 2 privates and started repairs. 20 minutes of work in the open. Hands so cold he couldn't feel the wrench. Muscle memory from Detroit, keeping him functional. A German sniper put a round 2 inches from his head. Foster didn't stop working. Couldn't stop. Tank was blocking the advance. He'd fix it or die trying. Track reconnected in 18 minutes. Foster climbed back in, covered in oil and ice and German dirt. The tank kept moving. Lieutenant Knowles identified the German command post, a 2-story house with radio antennas. He called in artillery. 1 strike, precise, devastating. The house collapsed in fire and smoke. German defense lost coordination immediately. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the 1st American Sherman broke through the southern edge of the encirclement. Knowles was 3 tanks back. He watched the lead tank roll past the last German position and keep going. Road to Bastogne open. Radio call at 2:35. We're through. Corridor secure. 4 German panzers destroyed. 180 German casualties. 12 American tanks disabled. 8 destroyed completely. 41 American casualties. The 7-mile perfect ring shattered in 8 hours. At 4 in the afternoon, Captain Dwyer's column rolled into Bastogne's perimeter. Paratroopers from the 101st Airborne stood watching. Some were crying. They'd expected to die here, expected to fight until ammunition ran out and then surrender or freeze. "Where the hell did you come from?" one paratrooper asked. "Third Army," Dwyer said. "Patton sent us." Supply trucks followed the combat vehicles. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, everything the trapped men hadn't had for a week. Inside Bastogne, wounded soldiers in freezing cellars were getting morphine for the first time in days. The men inside had been written off. Everyone knew they were lost. Patton had never accepted that math. German command posts were chaos. Entire American army appeared from nowhere. How? Where was intelligence? Withdrawal orders went out by 6 p.m. The perfect trap was broken. No way to re-establish encirclement with Third Army positioned south. The Wehrmacht officers who'd been laughing 3 days ago were now trying to explain to Berlin how they'd missed an army. By nightfall, December 26th, the siege was over. But Patton wasn't finished. The Germans were retreating east, and he intended to destroy them. For the men who'd made the impossible march, who'd driven through fog and ice and darkness for 72 hours, the fighting was just beginning. What the Wehrmacht had dismissed as impossible had happened in 3 days. Now they'd learn what else Americans could do when everyone said it couldn't be done. December 27th. The day after victory, Captain Jim Dwyer was supposed to press the attack eastward, chase the retreating Germans, keep the momentum, standard military doctrine, exploit the breakthrough. He could barely keep his eyes open. 1,400 men dead or wounded during Patton's pivot and the breakthrough, another 2,000, with frostbite so severe they couldn't hold weapons. 600 vehicles lost to ice, cliffs, mechanical failure, and combat. These were the numbers nobody mentioned in the victory telegrams going back to headquarters. Dwyer sat in a frozen cellar in Bastogne, trying to write letters to families. 23 men from his battalion dead, 41 wounded. How do you tell a mother in Ohio that her son froze to death, driving a supply truck through fog? That he died so strangers could live? The schoolteacher who used to grade algebra tests was now grading which deaths had meaning and which were just random mathematics. His hands shook holding the pen. Not from cold anymore. From something else. 9 days since this started. Maybe 20 hours of sleep total. Still fighting. German counterattacks hitting every day. The rescue wasn't an ending, just a new beginning. December 29th, 1944. Lieutenant Bob Knowles survived the breakthrough. His Sherman tank took 11 direct hits during the assault on Assiniboia. Armor held. Math worked. The insurance salesman's risk calculations had been perfect for 9 straight days. He was helping repair another tank when German artillery opened up. Random fire. Harassment shelling. Nobody aimed at anything specific, just dropping rounds into Bastogne, hoping to hit something. One shell landed 30 feet from Knowles. Killed him instantly. Killed 3 mechanics with him. No heroic last stand. No dramatic final moment. Just probability catching up. 9 days of perfect calculations ended by random chance he couldn't assess or avoid. Sergeant Mike Foster found the bodies. He survived impossible odds to die doing maintenance work. Knowles's wife in Philadelphia got the telegram January 4th. It said he died in action near Bastogne, Belgium, and that he'd served with distinction. It didn't say he'd made decisions that kept hundreds of men alive. It didn't say he'd done impossible things. It just said he was dead. December 30th. Sergeant Foster was working on his 18th straight day. Hadn't slept more than 90 minutes at a time since December 19th. His hands were permanently numb, frostbite turning fingers black. But tanks still needed fixing, so he kept working. He was underneath a Sherman replacing a transmission when something broke inside him. Not the equipment, him. Just stopped, crawled out from under the tank, and sat in the snow staring at nothing. A medic found him 20 minutes later. "Sergeant, you okay?" Foster looked at his hands. Black fingers. Couldn't feel them. Couldn't remember the last time he'd felt them. "I can't feel my hands," he said. "Can't remember why we're here." They evacuated him for exhaustion and exposure. The Detroit mechanic who'd kept an army moving through impossible conditions finally broke. He'd lose 4 fingers to frostbite. All on his right hand, the hand he'd used to fix cars since he was 16. He never worked on cars again after the war. The fighting continued through New Year's. Third Army pursuing Germans east, Bastogne secured, but the Battle of the Bulge wouldn't officially end until January 25th. 6 more weeks of combat. American casualties for the entire Bulge, 89,000. German casualties, over 100,000. The rescue everyone celebrated happened in one day. The battle lasted 6 weeks. Nobody back home understood that difference. German officers filed post-battle reports. How did we miss an entire army repositioning? Answer: Patton's radio silence, the weather, and their own assumption that Americans couldn't maneuver in winter. One Wehrmacht analysis concluded. Enemy mobility exceeded all calculations. Previous assessments of American winter capability were fatally incorrect. They'd learned, too late. The mockery had turned to grudging respect. But respect doesn't bring back the dead. By January 1945, Bastogne was saved. Germany was retreating. Victory was coming. But the men who'd made Patton's pivot possible were scattered. Knowles dead from random artillery. Foster broken and missing fingers. Dwyer still fighting but hollowed out inside. They'd done the impossible. And it had cost them everything that couldn't be measured in miles or hours or days. The history books would remember the maneuver. The men who executed it would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. End of chapter 5 to 500 words. January through May 1945. War's end approaching. Captain Jim Dwyer kept fighting. Third Army pushed into Germany. He got promoted to major by March. Received a Bronze Star for the Bastogne operation. The medal came with a citation about extraordinary leadership under impossible conditions. He put it in a drawer and never looked at it again. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. War in Europe over. Dwyer was there when it ended. Didn't feel like victory. Felt like exhaustion with a finish line. September 1945. Home to Akron, Ohio. The school district offered his teaching position back. High school algebra, quadratic equations. Teenagers who didn't want to be there. He tried. Lasted 6 months. Students noticed he'd zone out, staring at maps on the classroom wall. Flinch when doors slammed. One kid asked about the war once. Dwyer walked out of class. Didn't come back for 3 hours. He quit teaching in March 1946. Took a job driving trucks, long hauls, overnight routes. The movement felt familiar. The solitude felt necessary. Never attended 4th Armored Division reunions. His wife asked why once. He walked out of the house. Came back after dark. Never asked again. Jim Dwyer died in 1989. Heart attack. 67 years old. His obituary in the Akron paper mentioned he was a decorated World War II veteran and beloved father and grandfather. At the funeral, another veteran showed up. Man Dwyer hadn't seen in 44 years. He stood at the casket and said to Dwyer's son, "Your father did impossible things, saved thousands of lives. But he never left Bastogne. Just took him 44 years to die there." Sergeant Mike Foster got discharged March 1945. Medical discharge. Missing 4 fingers on his right hand. Purple Heart. Disability pension. Ford Motor Company in Detroit offered him a job. Management position. Not mechanic work, couldn't do that anymore, but supervising other mechanics. He refused. "Can't do the work I love. Won't pretend to manage it." Took the disability checks. Worked at a bowling alley setting pins. Drank heavily from 1945 to 1950. Wife left him in 1948. Told him, "You're still in Belgium. I can't compete with ghosts." He sobered up in 1951. Remarried. Different woman. Never told her about the war. She knew he'd been there, saw the missing fingers, but he never spoke about it. In 1964, Life magazine ran an article about Bastogne's 20th anniversary. Foster saw it at a doctor's office. Had a panic attack. Full breakdown. Couldn't breathe. His second wife asked what happened. He couldn't explain. Foster died in 1997. His grandchildren found his medals in the attic after the funeral. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, campaign ribbons. He'd never mentioned them. Not once. The numbers that remain. Patton's pivot took 72 hours from order to breakthrough. 250,000 men repositioned. 133,000 vehicles moved. Fastest large-scale military maneuver in history. The record still stands today. West Point teaches it. Military historians study it. It's called The Impossible Made Routine. But the curriculum doesn't mention Lieutenant Knowles dying randomly after surviving the impossible. Doesn't mention Foster's missing fingers or Dwyer's 44-year haunting. Just the maneuver, just the victory, just the numbers. Patton's grease pencil map. The actual one showing the pivot sits in a display case at West Point Museum. Tourists photograph it, study the lines, marvel at the audacity. Veterans sometimes stand in front of it silently. One museum docent reported an old man crying in front of the display in 1986. When asked if he was okay, the man said, "I drove that line. 72 hours through hell. Nobody knows what it cost." Then he walked away. The last veteran of Patton's pivot died in 2014. Age 93. The newspaper obituary mentioned his service. Didn't mention what he'd survived. Didn't mention what it took from him. They never do. December 2024. 80th anniversary ceremonies at Bastogne. Dignitaries praising Patton's genius. Historians explaining tactical brilliance. Museum displays showing the map, the timeline, the statistics. 72 hours that changed everything. What they don't show. The telegram, arriving in Philadelphia, telling Knowles's widow he's dead. Foster's blackened fingers that never healed. Dwyer's nightmares, lasting 44 years. German mockery ended December 26, 1944. Perfect encirclement, shattered by an army that moved faster than intelligence could track. Mathematical impossibility made real through frozen determination. But the men who did it paid in ways battles don't measure. Sleep never recovered. Warmth never felt again. Peace never found. At the Bastogne Memorial, a restored Sherman tank sits under museum lights. Polished, perfect, looks nothing like the ice-covered machine Knowles died beside. The placard reads, 4th Armored Division, Patton's Relief of Bastogne. Doesn't mention the insurance salesman from Philadelphia who calculated every risk except random artillery. It never does. Patton's pivot. 72 hours. Impossible made routine. The ring shattered. But the men who shattered it? Still frozen in Belgium, wrapped in fog that never lifts. History remembers the victory. Ghosts remember the cost.